The Lord does not need your money.
That's my favorite little intro.
Really?
He was arrested 42 times. Is that correct? When you think about the beginnings of the wealthiest church in the world, you don't think of it being founded by somebody who was arrested 42 times.
Yeah, there's a lot. The legality stuff is massive. I mean, and our run-ins with the Lord now, suggest that anybody who's like that, they're probably not great, trustworthy people in our community. And there's definitely a bit of that with regard to Joseph. He was on the outer of the law a significant part of his life, which is big.
For his time, was it common for people to be arrested for the things Joseph was arrested for at that time?
That's a good question. I live in New Zealand, and the judicial system is robust, but it certainly isn't something that I engage with, very frequently. But in the United States, particularly in the early 1900s, the early 1800s, sorry, there was a lot of utilizing of the court system to be able to satisfy conflicts. And this was a big part of democracy, big part of civilization, actually, the idea that you didn't have to come to blows with each other in order to satisfy a disagreement, that you could go to some arbiter and get some ruling. And this became the law, what we engage in. And certainly Joseph engaged in the law really early on in the piece. There are anecdotal kind of evidences, and there are also court records, because of course this is a printing press age. People wrote things down, and so we actually have the transcripts of court documents, which makes studying Joseph Smith's legal life fascinating and extensive and amazing, really.
So you didn't have to go to blows to get your way, but Joseph did.
Yes. Yes, and actually, the idea that you could take somebody to court over assault was a mechanism that gained people a lot of safety in terms of their ability to feel like this was civilization, and it wasn't just going to be who was the strongest would always win. You could have people on your side because you had a better argument, not just better fists and strength.
Yeah.
One of the big things I think, if you're thinking about how Joseph and might have felt about the legal system, is looking at actually the Book of Mormon, the ways in which it describes lawyers, because that's and it mirrors the Bible, because the Bible was written by kind of poor, marginalized people, and they often talked in the negative about lawyers. And certainly the Book of Mormon is in the same kinds of things. But I think that that's actually related to Joseph's experience. He had, by the time that the Book of Mormon had been written, he'd been involved in maybe 4 cases already. And I think that's really significant, and something that we don't even think about.
Yeah. Hello, beautiful humans. Welcome to The Revolution. I'm your host, Megan Connor. And today I have with me Ganesh Cherian, the author of Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism, a topical biography, which I've had so much fun searching through this book. It is rather large, so I have not read the whole thing, but I have absolutely loved diving into it. Ganesh, thank you for joining me again. It's always so nice to have you here.
Well, it's a treat to be with you, Megan, and gosh, we have lots of fun when we're together, so I'm excited about the time.
Yes, of course. So we are going to dig into Joseph Smith's legal history a little bit. I know there's only so much we can talk about unless we want this to be a 6-hour episode, but I do want to talk about some of his legal troubles and some of his convictions and how that related to the formation of the church. And I know that you are just a wealth of knowledge when it comes to not only Joseph, but really American history during that time period. And you have a lot of context to share with us. So I'm excited for what we're going to learn today.
Oh, great. Well, I'll try and keep it really simple, and then so that you get a good overview. And then, if, depending on how people react and what they might want to know, maybe we can do some more, because there's some really lovely details once you get into them. But it's worth understanding the kind of overall context and what's going on and why, because it gives us a really good grounding to go, oh, I understand it. And I think Joseph's legal interactions are some of the most rich kind of testimony about his life and some of the events of church history that we don't take into consideration, because some of it's messy, but also often it's not always very complimentary of Joseph, and so it's
Right.
kind of been often ignored or downplayed or just not even referenced. So
Right. And I just want to say, from my perspective, as a lifelong Mormon, 7th generation Mormon, I was always told whenever I asked about Joseph Smith's legal troubles, or, I guess when I was taught in seminary church history, a lot of times they would kind of gloss over all of this and just put it all under the blanket that people were jealous of Joseph because he claimed to have this special connection to God, and they didn't like what he was preaching because it was contrary to what they believed. And so they would all trump up all these charges against him and try to get him sent to prison as often as they could. And certainly his death in the jail was always glorified as a martyrdom instead of accurate representation of why he was there, what he got up to while he was there, and all of that. So I know it's a lot to dig into, but was that sort of your impression as well in the early days of your faith?
Yeah, absolutely. These were evidences of persecution, and also
Yes.
evidences that if you are doing the right thing, Satan will come out in all of his ways to try and thwart you. And so,
Right.
yeah, it's interesting how you can suggest a narrative that people who are in these particularly tricky and immersive legal and criminal convictions or charges, probably more so,
Yeah.
that they, for some reason, they're the best people, not the people that are charging them with crime. So
Right.
yeah.
So I know that you've prepared some slides for us to talk about today, but I'd like to start first with what you hinted to in the opening, that Joseph had already been arrested 4 times before he even wrote the Book of Mormon. So can we just quickly talk about those arrests?
Oh, sorry, he hasn't been arrested 4 times.
Oh, okay.
But he had 3 to 4 legal cases.
Okay.
So the first one is at actually 1919. So he's only like 14 years old. He's a witness in a case for his father. His father's brought up a charge against a former employer that he's been kind of cheated of not being paid correctly. And Joseph Smith Sr. Is working with his son, Joseph Smith Jr. So Joseph Smith Jr. is a witness in this case. And Joseph Smith Sr. Wins this case. But the person who's the defendant files an appeal. Joseph Smith Sr. hasn't responded to the appeal correctly in terms of the law. And effectively, the defendant wins the appeal and gets damages against the Smiths. So this goes sideways, like they think they've won, they're celebrating as if they won, and actually they lose, and they lose big.
Wow.
And this underpins, really the Smiths and perhaps their poverty and their marginalization, that they just don't understand the rules of the law, and they feel completely taken advantage of. And this sentiment, I believe, makes its way into the Book of Mormon with the heavy anti-lawyer sentiment from that particular case. The idea that lawyers are out to kind of get the common man, that they're going to, be corrupt, that they're going to use their wiseness and prowess to gain money at the expense of the everyday person. Joseph also does get arrested in 1826 for glass looking. So he's been hired by Josiah Stowell to be to look for treasure, to use his seer stone to money dig in Harmony, Pennsylvania. That's how come he goes to the Hales farm, and that's where he meets and then eventually marries Emma. But he's there as a seer, using his stone on a hat, and then after that finishes quite quickly, he actually goes and lives with Josiah Stowell in Colesville and South Bainbridge in New York. So it's over the border, not far from Harmony, Pennsylvania. And his nephew, Josiah Stowell's nephew, believes that his uncle is being taken advantage of by this con man, and brings up Joseph on charges. And so he gets arrested. He has to appear before a court. He has a number of people who testify. And because this is early 19th century America, we have a record of it. And we have a kind of a transcript of some of the witnesses and the witness statements. And they all talk about Joseph utilizing his stone. And Joseph talks about utilizing his stone. It's not entirely clear what the outcome of the trial is. There is some indication that Joseph is convicted, but that he, because of his age and because Josiah Stowell testifies for him, the court kind of either dismisses the case or convicts him, but it's a minor conviction for which he, it's mostly embarrassment rather than and reputation rather than anything severe like a prison term or anything. But he's, during this trial, he's held in jail. He is, people come and kind of examine him and provide testimony. And so there's actually quite a lot of richness in this take that shows that kind of early treasure digging environment that he's in, and the kind of role he has as the seer in this space. So there's that court case. Then
so he would have been around 21-ish, right, at this time?
Yeah, I think he's 1920, so he's a young man.
I thought it was curious that in the case when he was a witness, he was around 14, so that would have been right around first vision time, maybe a year before the first vision. So
yes, that's right.
Yeah, it's just interesting to note.
and that's really the own, in terms of contemporary evidence, that's the only evidence we have of Joseph, that he even existed, because he didn't write anything down. The Smiths were incredibly poor. Joseph didn't keep a journal or anything, there's no evidence that he kind of even exists, before the Book of Mormon, right? That's his burst onto the public scene.
Yeah.
The other court case that he's involved in, well, actually, this particular one is a little bit suspect, or we don't know if it exists because we don't have the court documents.
Okay.
And we only know about this because Lucy Mack Smith, in her biography, talks about a situation in early 1829 where Lucy Harris, this is Martin Harris's wife, brings a charge against Joseph for defrauding her husband. And Lucy Mack tells the story that Joseph is actually in Harmony at this point, so he doesn't come for it, but the family kind of go to the court on his behalf, and Martin Harris testifies for Joseph, and the case is dismissed. So we don't have any legal records that show this. So it might be maybe Lucy Mack is conflating some other ideas and reminiscences. She's recalling this from some 15, 16 years earlier. So it's
so
not
it's a late
sure.
account.
Yeah, but if that's true, Joseph was certainly being scrutinized for his work alongside the Book of Mormon, and the ways that it was that some people like Lucy Harris felt was a con, and that was defrauding her family, and so that was certainly the case, and we have other evidence that even if there wasn't a court case, definitely Lucy Harris felt this way, and we have evidence that Martin Harris was worried about these kinds of things.
Yeah, so this would have been over the lost 116 pages where Martin Harris was going to give some money to Joseph Smith to help with the printing of the Book of Mormon. Am I remembering that correctly? Or
this is the beginning part of 1829, so it hasn't got to the printing of the Book of Mormon yet.
Okay, got it.
It does have that idea that Lucy Harris is worried that Martin is giving resources to Joseph, which are not great for her. Yeah.
So Lucy brings this case to court, and Martin Harris, her husband, testifies on behalf of Joseph?
Correct.
That must have caused
that's what
interesting...
Lucy reports, yes.
Yeah. That must have caused some issues in their marriage, I would imagine.
And this is the case for Josiah Stoll, right? His nephews brought this case, and yet Josiah Stoll speaks for Joseph.
Yeah.
Which goes to the idea that Joseph is really good at the people who he's maybe defrauding don't feel defrauded.
Right. That's so interesting, but it speaks to his charisma and his ability to, form attachments with people.
Mm. So all of these events presumably are before the Book of Mormon is written, and so you can kind of see echoes in the ways that the Book of Mormon addresses the ideas of lawyers and their role, and the Book of Mormon is particularly anti-lawyer, and Joseph is poor and marginalized and subject to the law, rather than feeling empowered by the law.
Right.
So that's quite a big deal. And then he goes on to have a number of other lawyer things happen. So should we do the slides? That might give us kind of a little overview. One of the things that came out recently, actually, that I thought was worth just kind of putting in here is that the church did a essay about 5-6 months ago talking about Joseph Smith's character, because there had been a few maybe attacks on Joseph Smith's character. John Turner published his book, The Rise and Fall of an American Prophet, and I published my book, Joseph Smith, the Architect of Mormonism, and right around that time, the church did a statement, a mini gospel topics essay on Joseph Smith's character, and one of the points that they addressed was Joseph Smith's legal activities, and so I thought these might be quite good to show how the church is trying to frame these in context of what we're talking about today. Do you want to read them for us, Mickey?
Oh, sure. Well, I'll read the first part and then we can talk about it. So Joseph Smith was the defendant in 21 known criminal cases. Many of these cases resulted from prejudice against the Latter-day Saints or false allegations against Joseph Smith. Almost all of them were dismissed due to lack of evidence or did not progress to trial. For example, when the Saints were driven from Missouri, Joseph Smith was imprisoned on unjust charges, while mob members who killed, beat, stole from, and harassed church members were not prosecuted.
So that goes back to what you said right at the very beginning about the narrative of that Joseph is the innocent one, and there's others who are utilizing legal means to persecute and harass him.
Yeah. So existing records document only one unambiguous criminal conviction. In 1843, Joseph visited a city lot in Nauvoo that he believed had been unfairly seized by a county tax collector. The discussion between Joseph and the tax official escalated from verbal argument to a physical confrontation. Immediately afterward, Joseph Smith voluntarily submitted to a local justice of the peace, confessed his guilt, and paid a fine.
Yes. So the character of Joseph Smith essay basically only admits to one criminal conviction, and that it was that Joseph was voluntarily submitted, realized he was on the wrong and made sure that he fixed it right away. So
now this is one of those I wish that faithful people would talk about more, because this is kind of an example of this narrative that yes, Joseph was a prophet of God, but he was also a fallible human being. But as soon as he realized he'd done wrong, he went to the authorities, confessed his guilt, and paid the necessary fine. That to me is a testament that somebody's character is actually of good character, because all of us lose our temper. We all do things we regret. But, Joseph made reparations immediately afterwards. So I would think that would be a story that faithful people would want to tell. But I never heard this one when I was in the church either.
Yes, and they're only saying it in this particular context because it's going to come up, particularly in John Turner's book and slightly in mine, actually there's a lot of legalities around Joseph. And some of the narratives that we have told, just are so simplified.
Yeah, for sure.
I would suggest this is really trying to paint this picture as beautiful as it possibly can.
Yeah.
And perhaps the idea that you can, look at some of these things, you might find that these are, I like the word, they use the word one unambiguous criminal conviction, which suggests that there are multiple ambiguous criminal
right.
convictions.
So we should note though that this text that you're displaying here that I just read, does this come from the Gospel Topic Essays or the Joseph Smith papers? Okay.
This is from the Gospel Topic Essay.
Okay.
The Joseph Smith Papers project is a lot more detailed and a lot more candid.
Yeah. So just for people who may be unaware, the Gospel Topic Essays are published by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints on their website. And it has sort of become known, at least in the former Mormon circles, as a way for the church to address problems or problematic history in as faithful way as possible. And so reading that slide, I think they very much gloss over things and they leave out a lot of context. And I've always learned when you're on the church website, you always have to click through all the footnotes to get even close to the whole story.
Yeah. In talking about this, I thought it might be good to share some things that I think are worth knowing about the whole situation.
Yeah.
I mean, we could go into these. These are all discussions of their own merit, but I just so that people who are trying to understand might be able to get a little bit of a cliff notes to begin with. So, Joseph Smith was involved in the court system early as a witness. So we just talked about that. He initiated lawsuits as well as responded to them. So, it's not just that people took him to court; he took other people to court too. I think that's important to know.
Yeah.
It's important to know that states had a robust judicial system. Even then, in the early part of the 19th century, like the fact that you had and were involved in a state meant that you had a judicial system. If you were in a territory, that might not be the case, or that might be a lot looser. We often reminisce or about the United States, and we talk about the Wild West. What we're talking about is a territory where there's, judicial oversight is not very sophisticated. But if you were in a state, and the whole time Joseph was alive, he was in a state, right? He was in New York State, Pennsylvania State, Ohio State, Missouri State, and Illinois State, and they all had quite robust legal systems, even when they were on the frontier. So a good example of this was that Lilburn Boggs, who had been the governor of Missouri, had been shot. It was an attempted assassination. And Lilburn Bogg believed that this was Joseph Smith, that he had sent Porter Rockwell, his bodyguard, to shoot him. And so Lilburn Bogg, demanded that Joseph and Porter Rockwell be extradited and brought to justice. We'll talk about this a little bit later, but Joseph evaded that extradition, and he wasn't extradited. But Porter Rockwell was, and he stood trial for that. And even in Missouri, where there was a lot of prejudice and where they believed that these men were guilty, Porter Rockwell went through the legal system there and was acquitted. They didn't find enough evidence to convict him, and so he was let go. This is incredible, when you think about it, because it's not like mob justice where everybody thinks you're guilty, so you're guilty. Even Missouri, on the border, on the frontier, had a robust legal system that acquitted Porter Rockwell in 1843, I think it was.
That's pretty incredible.
That is really incredible and really important to understand about how robust the legal system is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not always fair. I'm not saying it is, but it's sophisticated.
Yeah.
Another thing to note is that most of what we know about the Danites is from the cases that were brought against Joseph in Missouri when he was.
Yeah. So, for those who don't know about the Danites, can you just give us a, sort of quick and dirty explanation of who these people were?
So the Danites were a kind of a secret paramilitary police force of Joseph Smith, and they did some pretty terrible things in Missouri, and effectively Joseph disowned them afterwards. But the legal cases show that Joseph was heavily involved in their implementation and their direction, which is something that the church has often denied. The idea that Joseph wouldn't have done a secret military police. That's not who he was. But the court records from multiple people attest to that, and that's what we know pretty much everything about the Danites in Missouri because of the court documents, not because of other things.
Yeah.
In Nauvoo, Joseph got the Nauvoo City Charter gave Joseph gave the Supreme Court in Nauvoo huge legal powers, and Joseph, was the head of that. So, it's a big deal.
Yeah. And again, for people who may not be familiar with church history, Nauvoo is a city in Illinois that Joseph founded as a place where that would be a safe refuge for Mormons to live without persecution. And so he essentially set up the whole government of the city and elected himself. Well, I mean, it may be somewhat separate, but there was the Council of 50, of which he elected himself king of the world. But essentially that's what he was doing, was setting up Nauvoo as a place where he would have as much power as possible over everything that happened in the city.
Yeah, it was very, very successful generally of doing that. One of the great powers he employed was a a writ called habeas corpus, which was the idea that, again, this robust legal system of the early 19th century involved this idea that you shouldn't just be detained for no good reason, that you could be detained, obviously you could be arrested, right? But then you would be brought before some magistrate to make sure that the detainment was valid and acceptable and reasonable, because you didn't want just people getting arrested every single day and spending their lives in prison, right? That you were allowed to go before a judge, and the judge would go, that's reasonable or that's not reasonable. And if it wasn't reasonable, they could chuck the case out and basically say, no, you can't be held for that. So habeas corpus was that mechanism that allowed you to do that, and Joseph used that as his superpower. And maybe we'll get to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah.
Joseph was charged with treason twice and held in jail. He was held in Liberty jail on treason. He was held in Carthage jail on treason.
That's a big deal.
Yeah, people don't realize, they go, oh, he was held in jail. This is treason. This is the worst thing that you could possibly be in jail for.
The thing that people were hanged for. This it's a huge deal. And it just amazes me that people don't talk more about this.
It's a capital offense, right? You can be executed because of this. And there's no bail. You can't just go home in between your court. If you're held on treason charges, you are held in jail till either you're convicted or acquitted.
Mm-hmm.
The other part of that is that Joseph brought the state of Missouri to the brink of civil war twice. There's the Zion's Camp in 1834, and then there's the Mormon Missouri War in 1838. And what's little known, because it didn't end up happening, right? He brought the state of Illinois to the brink of civil war, which is why he was being held in jail for treason in Carthage, because he was murdered, and that never that never went to trial. He never got convicted because he died, right? So
right.
And there's certain amounts of some of the convictions or some of the charges that he had against him were charges which he wasn't, the church here says correct, he wasn't convicted of these charges, but was he guilty? Well, there's certainly amount of case. The fact that he died beforehand means he never went through the jury process. But
right.
Yeah. The other part is that, and this I describe in the book quite well, I think, is Joseph's trajectory. He goes from being in this poor, marginalized situation in New York, where the lawyers are against him and the legal system is unjust, and this features in the Book of Mormon. But he starts to realize in Ohio and through into Missouri that he needs the help of lawyers, and there's a point at which he actually becomes a lawyer. He talks about studying to become a lawyer. So, the idea that Joseph is an actual lawyer, or that he's studying for this case, is really important. And of course, because of this Nauvoo City Charter and the courts, the municipal court in Nauvoo having these great powers, Joseph is the judge. And so he's now not only bringing cases to the law, he's actually deciding on cases of the law. So these just amazing. The whole legal thing with Joseph is amazing on lots of different fronts, not just criminal arrests and things like that, but civil suits and the ways that he judged between various parties. These are all part of court records that are available to us today.
Yeah, so this is one of the things that amazes me about Joseph Smith, is that he was 32 years old when he was killed. Is that right? 32?
38.
38 years old. By the time he was 38, he had written the Book of Mormon. he had established, an entire city. He never studied really the law, but he became a lawyer. He became a judge. He formed a militia. He formed a secret police group. I mean, he accomplished so many things in his short life, especially considering the fact that up until 19, 20 years old, he was messing around doing treasure digging. So if we just think in the 18 years that he was trying to form this religion, sell the Book of Mormon and all of that, when you think of everything that he accomplished, it really speaks to his charisma, again, his ability to form attachments with people and to have so many loyal followers who would literally leave their homes and go follow him to the next place. It's just, it's incredible when you think about it in these terms. But statistics are always super fascinating to me. And so I just always think, in 18 years or, arguably less than 20 years, he was arrested 42 times, accused of treason twice, formed a secret police, formed a militia, and brought 2 different states to the brink of civil war 3 times in total. I mean, when you think about it as a criminal record nowadays, I mean, it's just mind-boggling.
It's so good. And that's why I wrote a whole book on it, right? I wrote a whole book on Joseph's life because it's just so fascinating. You're like, this is incredible. And the stories are amazing. That one I talked about before about Port Rockwell, that's such an interesting story. And gosh, who knows that story? Nobody, right? It's just not a story we tell.
Right.
Yeah, it's just it is fascinating. So, if you go, one of the things that the church has done, which has been fabulous, has been investing in the Joseph Smith papers and making that available online. The whole reason I could even write my book here in Wellington, New Zealand, in my lounge, is because all of this is readily available online. Yeah. So everybody can go and do their own research. And the Joseph Smith papers project has assembled all of Joseph's cases that we have access to, made the transcripts available. You can go and read them. The Joseph Smith papers people are really good about giving great historical introductions and explanations. They're very forthright. It's got some bias, but it's pretty minimal. So where the gospel topics essay that we just read, it's got a huge amount of bias. The Joseph Smith papers are a lot more objective and a lot more matter of fact. So you can kind of go through this stuff and make some evaluations yourself. So these little introductions, I split Joseph's kind of legal situations into various places. So New York, Ohio, Missouri, Illinois. And these are the little introductions that you can go to on the Joseph Smith Papers Project, and it just kind of gives you an overview, and then it gives you more information, and then you can actually delve into the cases, and you can read the transcripts, all of those kinds of things. So you can, we're only just going to go at the kind of surface level, but know that there's a whole lot more to read. This is just a taster. Dive as deep as you want to go, and there's lots of resource on the Joseph Smith Papers Project to give you great context, give you incredible detail, and you can even go and look at the signatures, the documents. These are categorized and they're easy to find and easy to sort.
Yeah, perfect.
So this is their introductory paragraph on New York. Megan, do you want to read that for us?
Sure. Yeah. So between 1817 and 1831, Joseph Smith lived primarily in New York with periodic residences in northeastern Pennsylvania. During those years, he was involved in at least 4 legal cases in New York and 1 in Pennsylvania. In New York, he appeared as a witness. We already talked about this one in 1819 in a civil suit brought against a neighbor by his father, Joseph Smith Sr., and older brother Alvin Smith. In 1826 and twice in 1830, Joseph Smith was charged with violating the state's disorderly persons statute based on allegations stemming from his use of seer stones. Later in 1830, Joseph Smith was a voluntary party in an amicable action in Pennsylvania brought to ensure his payment of a loan.
So that's kind of a good overview of New York, and you can go and have a look at those cases. We talked about that 1826 glass-looking trial, and that was revived in 1830 twice, because people suggested that the Book of Mormon was effectively a seer stone fabrication and con, and it lends weight to the idea that the 1826 action was a conviction, and also that people went, look, he promised not to do it. We went soft on him because he said he wasn't going to do this again. But now he's produced the Book of Mormon using the same seer stone means. He's trying to defraud people, and so that's why those two cases in 1830 came up. So yeah, people were pretty upset that Joseph, continued with his seer stone use and produced something like the Book of Mormon, which they felt was defrauding the area.
Now imagine if they had been successful in that case and they had successfully obtained an injunction from a judge where Joseph Smith had been enjoined from publishing the Book of Mormon or talking about it. All of our lives would be so different today.
yeah, that's right. Well, that's what those 1830 cases were dismissed, I guess due to slight lack of evidence. Yeah, the idea that the seer stones produced the Book of Mormon was that, like I said, the court system in early 19th century America was pretty robust. They're not going, it's not a vigilante system, right? If there wasn't enough evidence, or they just couldn't convict on the statutes, then they wouldn't. So, this played to Joseph's advantage, whereas by the common court of opinion, he was definitely guilty, right? They were very upset with him. And this did mean that Joseph realized he couldn't stay in the area, and he eventually left. He went back to Fayette, New York. In the latter part of 1830, he met Sidney Rigdon, and then Sidney Rigdon invited him to come to Ohio. So he and the rest of the church relocated to Ohio. I guess he felt like, this was just going to keep happening. People were so upset with him, they were going to bring him before the law.
Wait a second. You said Sidney Rigdon invited him to go to Ohio. I thought it was a revelation from God.
Yeah. Yes. Yes. Well, it's amazing how Joseph got revelations that were in line with what he wanted to do and had opportunity to accomplish.
I think that if I were trying to form a religion, I would probably claim that God was saying to me whatever it was that I wanted to do also.
Yeah. Oh, yes. It's very smart.
I mean, what's the point otherwise?
Yeah. Gosh, if you've got all that power, why not use it?
All right. Do you want me to read this one?
Oh, yeah. Read that first paragraph, I guess is good.
Okay. In December 1830, Joseph Smith dictated a revelation commanding the fledgling church to relocate from New York to Ohio. Joseph Smith arrived with his family in Kirtland Township, Ohio in early 1831. He would reside in the state for the next 7 years. During Joseph Smith's time in Kirtland, he was involved in nearly 50 lawsuits as a plaintiff/complainant, defendant, witness, or interested third party. Most of these cases dealt with unpaid financial obligations. What a shock. Although a few resulted from entanglements with Joseph Smith's antagonists in Ohio. These cases were heard by justices of the peace as well as the county level courts of common pleas.
All right. So, yeah. I'll do the next one. Although the vast majority of Joseph Smith's nearly 50 cases in Ohio were civil in nature, he was involved in 4 criminal prosecutions. In 1834, Joseph Smith accused Dr. Philaster Holbert, a former Latter-day Saint, of threatening his life, and the court upheld his allegation. Another Ohio antagonist, Grandison Newell, brought an assault and battery charge against Joseph Smith in 1835 following an altercation between Joseph Smith and his brother-in-law, Calvin Stoddard. 2 years later, Newell alleged that Joseph Smith had threatened to take away his life. The Court of Common Pleas acquitted Joseph in both cases brought by Newell. In September of 1837, Joseph Smith filed a complaint accusing a constable of unlawfully using the law, and the Justice of the Peace, Oliver Cowdery, discharged this for lack of evidence. So some interesting things there. So there are two of those cases. Joseph brought against other people. One he won and one he lost. And Grandison Newell brought two cases against Joseph Smith criminally, one for assault of his brother-in-law, Calvin Stoddard. And this is true. This actually happened. Calvin didn't bring that assault charge against Joseph. Grandison Newell did. And Joseph managed to smooth things over with Calvin Stoddard such that when they went to court, Calvin Stoddard said he didn't want to, effectively he had forgiven Joseph, and the matter was settled before them, and so therefore the judge dismissed the case. So it's not that Joseph wasn't guilty of beating up his brother-in-law. It was just that they had settled it before the case, and so the case was dismissed.
Now, if I remember correctly about that case, there were several eyewitnesses to this incident, and so it's well documented that Joseph Smith indeed did engage in a physical altercation that was really quite brutal, if I remember correctly.
Yes, that's correct. There was concern that Calvin Stoddard would be blinded from this action, so it was really serious. And I guess when we go back to that original thing about from the Church's Gospel Topics essays that Joseph wasn't convicted, that's true. He wasn't convicted. Was he guilty? Absolutely, and that was that. So there's kind of a big conviction, guiltiness. There's And
this is one of the reasons why I have a little bit of a beef with the Gospel Topic essays, because I think they are I think there's a lot on the church website, and especially the church newsroom as well, that is written by attorneys. The church has a lot of attorneys at their disposal and in the higher leadership. And so, when you say Joseph was never convicted, well, yes, so that's true, but it's not completely honest.
Yeah, right. It's not that Joseph didn't do this or that he wasn't guilty of this. Yeah.
Right.
And these ones that are on the Joseph Smith papers are written by historians, and so they're more interested in understanding what's going on, not necessarily trying to evade some accusation.
Right.
The other case that Grandison Newell alleged that Joseph had threatened his life, the court documents for that are fascinating, and I hope that some of your listeners would go and have a look, because the testimony of that is really damning of Joseph, and it's from his friends. Like, his friends basically say, Joseph said that Grandison Newell's life wasn't worth anything, and if he got killed, it would be okay. Nobody would, God wouldn't be worried about that. But they said, but I don't think he was meaning that he was going to do it.
Right. Yes, I seem to remember the phrase, "Your life will be forfeit."
Yeah.
And it was such that in the Doctrine and Covenants, a lot of times Joseph would use, revelations from God to publicly rebuke people who had spoken out against him and things like that. So I'm sure that it was more of an insinuation that if you go against the prophet, then God's going to take your life, sort of a situation. Yeah.
There was a euphemism in the Doctrine and Covenants called that somebody would be given over to the buffetings of Satan.
Yes.
And that suggested that there was going to be some violence, Like it wasn't just a theological buffeting; it was a physical one.
Right. So the Danites, were kind of part of that. They were the buffetings of Satan.
Yeah, exactly.
They were the carriers out. They were the ones who carried out the buffetings of Satan.
So this case that Grandison Newell had brought before the courts, it resulted in Joseph being discharged. The court didn't find him guilty. I mean, Grandison Newell wasn't harmed. He just was. He was just threatened, and the court didn't find enough to be able to say Joseph. While the witnesses said yes, Joseph said these things. The court decided that wasn't enough to convict Joseph on those charges. But he certainly did say it, and Grandison Newell probably saved his life by making this a public thing, because it meant that Joseph couldn't then, enact violence. If he did enact violence, it would trigger the idea that this wasn't just him saying things, that this was a real intent.
Right.
So yeah. While the outcome wasn't a conviction, it probably did exactly what Grandison Newell wanted, and also saved his life. And anyway,
as a deterrent against future threats.
Yeah, that's right. And then soon after, Joseph fled to Missouri, which is this next. Do you want to read that first?
Sure. In early 1838, Joseph Smith relocated with his family from Ohio to northwestern Missouri to reside with the main body of the Latter-day Saints. During summer and fall that year, violent conflict broke out between the Saints and their antagonists in Missouri, resulting in the expulsion of church members and the incarceration of Joseph Smith in winter 1838 to 1839. Joseph Smith was named as a defendant in 7 criminal cases stemming from this conflict. He was also a party in at least 4 civil cases in the state. These cases were brought in Missouri's circuit courts.
I'll read the next bit and we can talk. In October 1838, Missouri Governor Lilburn Boggs ordered the expulsion of the Latter-day Saints from the state, as well as the arrest of Joseph Smith and other ringleaders of the rebellion. Joseph Smith was incarcerated in the winter in the jail in Clay County, that's Liberty Jail. In April of 1839, a grand jury for the Davis County, Missouri Circuit named Joseph Smith as a defendant in 6 criminal indictments for treason, riot, larceny, receiving stolen goods, and twice for perjury. And the Ray County, Missouri court named him as an accessory, and arson, and named him as an accessory to murder in a 7th indictment.
So this is a long rap sheet. I'm sorry, but this is probably the worst part of it. So we have treason, riot, larceny, receiving stolen goods, arson, and accessory to murder. Goodness.
Yes. But Megan, he was never convicted because he escaped.
Yes. Yeah. Well, and I think that's important to point out too. It's not that he wasn't convicted because he was tried by a jury of his peers and he went through the entire legal process. He just escaped. So
yeah, he escaped. So he was never held to account for this. It never went through a jury. He fled to Illinois, and look, this is right at the beginning of the early 19th century. And while I say that the judicial system was robust, there were some things that were still in flux, right? And one of them was, what do you do if somebody flees one state and goes to another state? What is the process of extradition? I mean, the states would uphold other states' claim on people, but it wasn't as clear cut as it is now. Basically states were like mini countries, and you couldn't just go and interfere in another state and for it to be, okay. There wasn't any such thing as federal police that had jurisdiction everywhere. And one of the crazy things is that Joseph probably initiated a lot of that discussion about what do we do with people who flee across the border, with regard to criminal acts. How do we make the extradition process robust and and quick and and effective.
Yeah, and even now, law enforcement they jealously guard their jurisdiction. And so, back then as well, it would have been frowned upon for, an officer of the law in Missouri to come into Illinois without informing Illinois authorities and all of that. So it was complicated. But can you also talk about how Joseph escaped?
Oh, yes. Well, so, gosh. Well, one thing to mention just before that is that it's worth, if you're really interested, this is a fascinating time period, Missouri. Effectively, Joseph Smith's only in Missouri basically a year. So what we have from the understandings of what's going on, like we talked about with the Danites and everything, that all comes from these court documents. And it's well worthwhile going in and looking at them because they're just fascinating and incredibly incriminating. But the testimonies from people who supported Joseph are even terrible. People are on the stand, so they have to tell the truth. They're not fudging anymore, and when they do, they really indict Joseph. So one of the crazy things that happened while so there's 7 people held in Liberty Jail, and one of their court appearances, because if you go to Liberty, you'll notice that the county court is just like it's a short walk from where Liberty Jail is, and so a lot of their kind of preliminary hearings are being held nearby, and in one of these preliminary hearings, Sidney Rigdon basically represents himself along these lines, and Sidney Rigdon's really sick at this point, and he's older than the others. His mental situation is not amazing. He manages to convince the court in Clay County that on a writ of habeas corpus that he should go free and not be held with the others. And so he actually gets out of jail free and leaves the state and goes to Illinois, where the Saints have fled to Quincy. And so Joseph is pissed off, Sidney Rigdon gets a get out of jail free card, and he's like, our lawyers are terrible. They didn't defend us properly. We should have got out like Sidney got out, and this habeas corpus thing, we're being held under duress, and he actually says this. So it's we have this in his journals. And so later, after this grand jury in April of 1839, they're now being set up to be tried. All of the preliminary evidence has been heard. There's enough to warrant a trial based on these things, right? And treason is the big one, but there's larceny, stolen goods, arson, accessory to murder. These are other really big things. Yeah. So Joseph suggests that they need a change in venue because the people around them are too prejudiced. And so he uses the writ of habeas corpus to suggest that he can't be tried fairly in either Clay County or Davis County, and so they sue for a change in venue. And when they're going to that new venue, he bribes the guards, and they let him escape. Yeah.
So we can add bribery to his rap sheet, and escaping incarceration.
Yeah, that's right.
So, yeah.
So he never gets convicted because he never stands trial because he's fled over the border to a different state. Yeah. Okay, so that's crazy, but this is Joseph, and this is what makes his life so interesting, right?
Yeah.
So we have a couple of things in here, and I've taken these all from the Joseph Smith Papers Project. There's much more, and it's very interesting, but I just thought these would be the ones that kind of give us good understanding what's going on, and it's fabulous. So do you want to read that first paragraph for us, Sarah?
Yeah. Following Joseph Smith's mid-April 1839 escape from Missouri state custody, he joined the main body of the Latter-day Saints in Illinois. Between 1839 and 1844, Joseph Smith was involved in approximately 130 legal cases in Illinois as a judge, plaintiff, or complainant, defendant, witness, or interested third party. He heard 77 of these cases as judge of Nauvoo, Illinois, Mayor's Court, and Chief Justice of the Nauvoo Municipal Court. The remaining cases dealt with various civil and criminal matters and were heard by justices of the peace and circuit courts in the Illinois court system, as well as by the federal courts in the state.
So there's a lot going on, it's massive. So there's, and the next bit, the three of Joseph Smith's best known legal cases in Illinois stem from crimes allegedly committed in Missouri. After Joseph Smith and the Saints established themselves in Nauvoo in 1839, Missouri officials attempted to have Joseph Smith apprehended and extradited. Joseph Smith was arrested in 1841, but after appearing on a writ of habeas corpus before the Judge Douglas in Warren County, he was discharged on the grounds that the warrant was invalid. The following year, Missouri officials again sought Joseph's extradition, this time for allegedly being an accessory before the fact to the May 1842 shooting of former Governor William W. Boggs. That's the Porter Rockwell case we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
After going into hiding to avoid arrest in late summer and fall, Joseph Smith appeared before the United States Circuit Court for the District of Illinois in January of 1843 on a writ of habeas corpus. We see that coming up again, right?
Mm-hmm.
Judge Pope discharged Joseph Smith on the grounds that the evidence supplied by the Missouri government was insufficient to justify the extradition. And then finally, in June of 1843, Missouri officials again sought Joseph Smith's extradition to answer an indictment charging him with committing treason in 1838. On the 1st of July, 1843, the Nauvoo Municipal Court discharged Joseph on a writ of habeas corpus. So this is the court he's in charge of, right? So this is his friends. They discharged Joseph on a writ of habeas corpus on the merits of the case. So,
yeah. So using his friends who were, in high places that he, that he appointed in high places.
It's crazy. So these are just the cases related to Missouri that are still not resolved because he hasn't stood trial for his, his stuff there.
Yeah.
So that's the bit of this. So this is other cases in Illinois about Illinois. If you want to read this.
Yeah, so this is what I find fascinating as well, is that in the formation of the Nauvoo Charter and giving himself all of this power, before he was kind of using, the Doctrine and Covenants revelations from God to, sort of tell people what to do. Now he can just bring cases into court whenever he wants. So this one says, Joseph Smith filed complaints in Nauvoo courts accusing multiple individuals of violating city ordinances by threatening or otherwise harming him. At the May 1844 term of the Hancock County Circuit Court, a grand jury approved 2 indictments against Joseph Smith for adultery and fornication and for perjury based on testimony from former Latter-day Saints and other opponents. The following month, on the 10th of June, the Nauvoo City Council, which included Joseph Smith as mayor, declared the Nauvoo Expositor, a newspaper operated by his antagonists, a nuisance, and ordered its destruction. One of the Expositor's proprietors, Francis M. Higbee, filed a complaint before a Hancock County Justice of the Peace accusing Joseph Smith and other Latter-day Saints of committing riot when they destroyed the Expositor's press. When vigilantes threatened to attack Nauvoo, Joseph Smith called out the Nauvoo Legion, his own little personal army, and declared martial law in the city on the 18th of June. Evidently based on this action, Augustine Spencer, one of Joseph Smith's critics, filed a complaint before a justice of the peace alleging that Joseph Smith had committed treason, a non-bailable offense that confined him to the Hancock County Jail in Carthage at the time of his murder.
So there's a lot in that, and gosh, that we could talk about this for hours. But a couple of things just to give an idea. So, Joseph was in charge of the city. He was the mayor. He was also the municipal court judge, right? So, one of the things that's the beginning there, it says that Joseph filed complaints in the Nauvoo courts against other individuals. So. And he was very powerful, of course, and he could decide on their outcome. So this became a form of intimidation in the city and control, right? He could bring people up on legal things. He could fine them. He often did. So Nauvoo became quite a really big problem because it's like he's in charge, and if you're an enemy, he can make the life miserable. Interestingly, William Law, his former second counselor, brought up indictments against Joseph for adultery and fornication, and they were going to be heard in October of that year, 1844, by the circuit court. But of course, Joseph died in June, so he was never convicted of those. He was just charged on that basis, and those weren't. He didn't have to go to jail or anything as part of that. It's just that was coming up and he would need to defend himself. And then of course he as the mayor destroyed the expositor press. This was a big deal because of course freedom of the press is massive in America now, but it was certainly in early 19th century because the whole idea was that if you were a free people, you could talk against the people who were in power. That was the thing that made America different to being a monarchy, or and so that was a massive deal. And of course, people charge him under the a course of riot. He set out the Nauvoo Legion to declare martial law. So martial law effectively locked down the city and restricted the movements of people in and out of the city on the basis that they were supporting Joseph, which again is, he didn't have the power to do that. That's only something that perhaps the governor could do. And also that restricted movement, which was also a freedom that, early 19th century Americans and still Americans today, feel very passionate about. So, so that suggested treason, that he was acting like a king more than he was acting like a civic, democratic elected, person who was subject to his citizens, and of course, this brought out Governor Ford, who came to assess the situation and brought the city of Nauvoo under standoff with the wider Illinois militia affected under Governor Ford, in which case Joseph gave himself up and was charged with treason and held in Liberty Jail. But of course, he never got to stand trial for that because he was killed on the 27th of June of 1844. So, but there are a number of documents, and you can go have a look at them because they're fascinating, about the letters back and forth from Thomas Ford to Joseph Smith, convincing him to give himself up and laying out a legal case that he's contravened the Constitution, and therefore needs to make account of that. So yeah, lots of documents that sustain these things, but of course it never went to trial, so he never was convicted. So the statement that he wasn't convicted is true. I mean, but the evidence is massive, and there are huge amounts of documents that kind of give you an understanding of this.
Right. He was not convicted, but he was also never acquitted.
Correct.
So important to say.
Yeah. And then, so that gives a kind of a good overview of things. I mean, we could drill down, and there's plenty to do, but we could be here for hours.
Yeah.
and maybe we could do that in the future. Just by finishing off, that I thought was useful was just to say that in that same Gospel Topics mini essay that talks about Joseph Smith's character, one of the subheadings is, did Joseph Smith pay his debts? And they make the case, and say he succeeded in paying off many of his debts, but others were unresolved at the time of his murder at age 38. Many of the Lord's commandments to Joseph Smith, publishing scriptures, establishing settlements, and building temples, required financial resources. Joseph and other church leaders sometimes took personal loans to support these efforts, and Joseph took his financial responsibility seriously, but paying those loans were challenging, and so he defaulted on a number of loans.
Yeah,
and it should also be said that he and this resulted in civil proceedings against him, which he lost many. So, while we say he's not convicted, but he was convicted on lots of civil charges.
Mm-hmm.
So that, and the Gospel Topics essay obscures that. It also doesn't say that he tried to get out of his debts by claiming bankruptcy in Illinois. So he was, but he wasn't allowed to do that.
Well, I also want to point out that they paint it as God was commanding him to do all these things that cost a lot of money. And so he would, maybe take out a personal loan or two to assist with those things. So they try to paint it like, well, God was telling him to do all this stuff. And so that's why he would go into debt. So
unfortunately, God was not providing any financial relief.
Right. And that's kind of, my understanding would be that, God would provide a way. Well, I guess that way was for Joseph Smith to borrow money from people.
and then default and have to, and have to flee, basically.
Right.
And there are lots of these cases, and they're all some of them are really fascinating. And I thought, just as an example of some of the civil, difficulties he had, this one was a really cute one that I thought was quite funny, and it was in the Joseph Smith Papers Project. And do you want to read that for us?
Sure. In Illinois, in September 1840, he and other Latter-day Saints purchased a steamboat from the federal government for $4,866.38, providing a promissory note as payment. They intended to use the boat to ferry church members and others for a fee on the Mississippi River. After operating for only about a month, however, the pilots crashed the steamboat on a sandbar, severely damaging it. The loss of the boat resulted in multiple lawsuits in the 1840s, as Joseph Smith and the other signatories attempted to recoup their losses and in turn were sued for unfulfilled obligations. In addition, federal officials in 1842 sued Joseph Smith and the other signatories in the United States District Court for the District of Illinois on the note to collect payment, resulting in a default judgment against them. So my question is, where was the discernment about where the sandbar was located in the Mississippi River?
No discernment, no funds, no ability to pay his debts, no forethought that this was going to happen. It does paint a picture of Joseph Smith as a regular person who is engaging in endeavors and unexpected things happening to derail them and put him into default of loans. And this is real life and real people, not necessarily a prophet of God who is getting direction daily of where the things are going to work out and how to bless his people. This is just real life. So
I mean, maybe in a scenario where there was a revelation of some kind, maybe God would have told the pilots not to go out that day, or maybe God would have caused some part to break on the boat so they couldn't go out that day or whatever. But this is speculation, is what it really is. It's a business endeavor for which he didn't have any money, and for which he didn't know if he was going to be successful. And maybe if the boat had run longer, it would have been financially successful. But, ultimately it was a risk, just like any other entrepreneurial venture.
Yes, absolutely. And Joseph it did that constantly throughout his life. He was always hoping that some great scheme would pay off, and then they didn't. The few things he was able to build, which were temples, didn't actually produce any income, right? So they were.
Right.
He was hoping that they'd build these grand things, and then people would flock in, powerful people, wealthy people, and they would support all this with money. It was a build it and they will come kind of scenario. And to some degree, he was correct. They did come. It was just the poor people who came,
right.
not the rich people. So his public works that were really relegated to those two kinds of things: his printing press endeavors, his canal building, his steamboat, all of these just did not come to any fruition and did not pay any dividends. So this was a bust. I mean, one of the endeavors he did, and it's a financial endeavor, and it's framed in the church as a spiritual one, but he was going to print 5,000 copies of the Book of Commandments and sell them. He thought that was going to be a big money spinner, and then after that, he was going to publish his new translation of the Bible, and that was going to be a massive money spinner. He set up a company to do that and had company directors. Like, this was a whole thing that is in the Doctrine and Covenants, but is obscured by now language. And then of course, this was going to be done in Jackson County, Missouri, with W.W. Phelps, and the people in Jackson County chucked out the members. They took the printing press and destroyed it, and so that whole endeavor just lost completely. If it had been in Ohio, it would have been fine. It would have been printed at least. I don't know if it would have sold like he envisioned. Members didn't have any money, so it had to be people outside, and I don't know. It would have been, I don't think they would have really cared about his revelations, but he thought that he was onto a money spinner. And
well, I mean, the Bible is technically the best-selling book of all time. And so, a Joseph Smith translation, although it's my understanding that his reputation was such in those parts that really it probably would not have been interesting to anybody but Mormons. And while, I don't know, it's just interesting to think about, Joseph probably never envisioned his church looking like it looks today. But I think if he could see it, he would be astonished and quite proud about how many billions, hundreds of billions of dollars they have.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it achieved his grand vision. It just didn't do that within his lifetime, or
right.
It really did get to that, He just, he just pissed so many people off in so many different ways. Like the amount of ways that he pissed them off, like he was, that was the end.
I think he managed to offend just about everybody that he, crossed ways with, except of course, the people who really believed he was a prophet and followed him as such. But, he angered financial people with his bank scheme. He angered government people with his appointing himself to all these positions. He angered lawyers because he wasn't actually a trained attorney. He angered parents of young women. He angered husbands and all kinds of people.
You're absolutely right. It was a powder keg and it just exploded.
Yeah.
And you see, too, just the numbers, like things are ramping up in Nauvoo. Like, it's getting worse and worse and worse and worse. Like, if he hadn't had been murdered, I mean, him being murdered was a godsend in some respects for the church, because he would have had to have, addressed those polygamy, adultery and fornication charges in October, right? He would have had to have addressed, the treason charges. This could have been the fall. But because he died, he was suddenly proclaimed a martyr. All our persecutors, we need to leave. It was the right moment for him to die, for it to work. And perhaps there are other movements of the time that their particular timing just didn't work out, and so we don't have those movements any longer, right? We don't really have the Shakers. We barely have the Quakers. Those movements just died out because the timing isn't quite right. It's interesting. One of the things I learned from writing the book, right, is that we ascribe so much in retrospect. The fact that this actually succeeded, we go, oh, it must have been special. But it was actually just part of everything that happened. The fact that it succeeded was just sometimes minuscule timings. If Joseph hadn't died at that particular moment, he couldn't have been revered as a martyr. Would have been convicted. His following would have fallen over. All kinds of things. We just don't know, of course, because we can't replay the history. But but the reality is that none of these things that we've talked about today with regard to his criminal or his civil, legal issues weren't things that were happening to other people too. People were testing the system and doing these kinds of things as well. It just, none of this suggests that God was involved in any of this. This was just people, taking advantage of other people and people getting upset and this is just normal human life, and a little bit extreme because it's early 19th century and this stuff is still being worked out. But crazy. And I think we have some people today who are doing the same kinds of crazy things that Joseph was doing. So it's not like it's that unique actually. So it's just painful when it affects so many people and and is so polarizing.
Yeah, I am going to definitely put your TikTok channel in the show notes so that people can go to your TikTok, because you have some fascinating commentary, comparing Joseph Smith to modern day public figures. And I think that's been fascinating for me to watch as well. And I also just will say that, throughout the history of mankind, humankind, there have been fraudsters and fakers. And, this was just another individual who spent his life trying to figure out the next con. And, we have plenty of people like that today. So it's not as though Joseph Smith was that unusual, but his endeavor ended up being something I don't think he ever envisioned it to be the way that it is now, but it turned out that way.
Yeah. Well said.
I guess my only other question too is I haven't researched enough about Joseph's death, but I'm curious about the makeup of the mob that stormed the jail. If you have any info about that, who were all of these people that came to the jail? How many were there, and what was their major beef?
Yes, it's a really good question. Actually, the kind of leaders we call them the mob, because it's a nice sound bite, but actually they were actually a militia, a militia from basically nearby Warsaw that were going to assist with the greater Illinois state militia. And they had a number of people that were senior, the senior military leaders, the people that were there. So those who actually stood trial for this, and they were acquitted again later. They were all very well-to-do people, businessmen. They all went on to be significant in Illinois politics and business. So they were well regarded in the community, is what I'm saying. Certainly one of those people was a guy called Thomas Sharp, who was the editor of the Warsaw Signal, and he'd traded literary blows with Joseph over some of the events, and he'd reported because Warsaw's really close to Nauvoo, and he'd reported on a number of concerns that local citizens and even internal citizens of Nauvoo were concerned about with regard to what was happening with Joseph. They really had seen him get off. We talked about those 3 times that he'd been they tried to extradite him to Missouri, and Joseph had got off all 3 of those with writs of habeas corpus. His power seemed to be almost unlimitless. So part of the violence to kill Joseph and Hiram was a belief that the legal system had failed them, that he wasn't going to be prosecuted for the things that he was guilty of, and that they needed to take the law into their own hands. And I think that's a really good kind of framing of the tension between the state civilization based on legal procedure that kept you safe, and then this kind of rogue bad actor who was just making a mockery of all of the things that they felt were sacred, the Constitution, the rule of law, and so that turned this otherwise law-abiding citizens who were pillars of their community into vigilantes, because they just didn't believe that Joseph was going to be held to account, and the only way he could be stopped was with an assassination.
Yeah,
and that's an incredibly interesting dilemma for then. And also now, what do we do if you have somebody running amok over the things that you feel are precious to you? So, it certainly was a breakdown in while how robust the legal system was in Ohio, in Illinois. It was also a breakdown that these people believed that they couldn't rely on the system to actually convict Joseph, and so they took him out.
Yeah, and it is a really interesting question to consider for now as well. What happens when there's a miscarriage of justice, when you feel that the court system, they've gone through the court system and yet they haven't been held accountable for reasons that we think they're guilty. One case that I can mention from recent American history is the Sean Combs case, where he was found not guilty of racketeering, essentially, with all these different criminal charges. I think mainly because people don't understand coercive control. And so, for the victims of that case, it's really devastating. But what is your legal recourse at that point? And I think, I'm never going to advocate for violence. I'm never going to advocate for vigilante justice. Because I just, I don't like violence in general, and I don't like the death penalty either. But, it is a really interesting moral question of, what do we do when we've exhausted the legal resources, but we know that there's somebody out there who's a really bad actor. I guess in Joseph's case, they just kept trying and kept trying and kept trying. And then, they decided that's a rabbit hole I really want to go down, because I want to understand the situation of those people who were in the militia that day.
Yeah, it's good. Well, maybe we can talk about that more, because it definitely is more information on that basis. And that's, again, going back to the very beginning, this is what makes Joseph so interesting, because it not only is his life interesting, but the ways that it plays out in American history and in those really key conflicting questions about where is the legal system, what's our protection, what do we do if people are operating outside the system or have been given favors that the rest of society don't get. These are incredible questions about fairness and justice and representation, and what it means to be a citizen, and how what is democracy, and these are really massive issues about the ways that we operate our lives and our civilizations. So that's That's why I wrote a whole book about all those kinds of aspects and issues. Yeah,
right. And again, I'm just going to say, you've done fantastic work on this book. I cannot imagine how many hours and hours you put into it. I definitely recommend it for anybody who, even if you have never been Mormon, but you just have a curiosity about Mormonism and Joseph Smith, and how, you have to understand Joseph Smith in order to understand Mormonism, and especially modern Mormonism. And I think this is a great way to do it, because, sometimes it can feel daunting to slog through an entire biography, but because it's topical, you can sort of pick and choose what interests you. And I love exploring it that way.
Fabulous. Well, that's all I hope, is that it would appeal, and particularly appeal to those in bite-sized points that you can go, oh, that's interesting, that's interesting, that's interesting, and really get something out of it. So
yeah. Well, I absolutely will have you back. We will talk again. I'm going to dig into some of these cases and do a little research, and then I can talk more intelligently.
Well, it's a rabbit hole. Make it,
Indeed.
But I know you have the chops for it, because I've seen what great work you've done on legal, ramifications and court cases. So
yeah, thank you. It's fascinating to me, and the human behavior behind it is really fascinating as well. So yeah, I love a good rabbit hole, and Joseph Smith has a lot of them.
Yes.
Well, thanks again for joining me, and we'll see you again very soon. Please take care.
Fabulous.